After serving for 2 years as a missionary with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, young Scott Parker went to work in the menswear department at the ZCMI store in Salt Lake City. He modeled suits on the local TV channel and became an expert in gold toe socks. However, he soon became interested in pursuing a graduate degree in healthcare administration and left retailing behind. Studying with the legendary James A. Hamilton at the University of Minnesota was challenging, but launched Parker on what was to be a lifetime of leadership in hospitals. He came up through the ranks at Northwestern Hospital in Minneapolis under the mentorship of Stanley Nelson, and then went on to his first CEO positions in Mesa, Arizona, and Newport Beach, California. A major turning point in his career brought him back home to Salt Lake City in 1975, when the LDS Church decided to divest its hospitals in the Rocky Mountain West. This unprecedented gift of the church resulted in the creation of Intermountain Healthcare, a nonprofit multi-institutional system, and Parker was chosen as its first president. He spent the next 23 years building, leading, and serving that organization. As his career progressed, he also served in leadership positions with many other organizations, including terms as board chair of the American Hospital Association and as president of the International Hospital Federation. In 2005, Parker was inducted into the Healthcare Hall of Fame. Following our selections from an oral history interview with Scott Parker and his wife Sydney that was conducted in 2013.
The reason that you were in Minnesota for so long was because after you earned your degree, you got a job at Northwestern Hospital. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
That was totally unexpected and resulted from the fact that I was assigned there to be a resident, administrative resident. The second year in graduate school, you were assigned to a hospital by the professor. And I was the only one in the class that didn't have a place to go. He gave you the chance to to recommend some places you might want to go from the approved list. And the three I wanted to consider and be considered for weren't available. Others were assigned to those. And there I was, the only one, and worried. And fortunately, a fellow named Stan Nelson arrived in town, coming back to Northwestern, where he was trained 10 years earlier, to be the CEO. He'd made a major change in management. And he was interested in having a resident. He'd been a resident there. And I was the only one without a residency. He wanted one. So we were just kind of put together fortuitously for me. And that was a fabulous year, learning from a wonderful man. I found great joy in his presence and in his friendship and in his tutoring. And unexpectedly and joyfully, he invited me to stay and be his assistant. And that was before Medicare. Wasn't all that complicated. So there were just two of us in the administrative staff of this significant hospital in Minneapolis at the time. And because there were only two of us, he was very generous and from the beginning in giving me lots of different assignments, departments to worry over, and gave me a chance to grow and learn on the job.
How would you describe Stan Nelson's management style?
Now, Stan Nelson was a master at the subtle. He was so bright, but never enjoyed trying to be the smartest guy in the room, though I always thought he was. He was a master of bringing other people out, getting their opinions, respecting their opinions, and he was a strategist. He really had a lot of understanding, look in the crystal ball and see where things were going. He liked to collaborate. He created his own group of friends across the country, put them into a little organization called The Group, and they would get together at the AHA, spend an afternoon sharing their experiences. The rules were you had to admit something that you failed at during the past 6 months and something that was successful. And from that dynamic, you bring a lot of things home, of ideas of good and bad about what to do and what not to do. Well, I was privy to all of that. And so I just was tutored as a result of his experiences. He'd come back and report, and later on he invited me into that group, and It was a very valuable tool through the years. It was called HRDI, Hospital Research and Development Institute. For me, being tutored by him was a great joy. And summing it up, you tell a lot of stories, but the one story I would like to tell was right in the beginning. I had finished my residency year. I was an assistant administrator, been there a couple of months in that job, and I heard he was going on vacation from his secretary. And the time came closer and closer, and he did invite me into his office to give me a briefing on the current issues and what I needed to look out for and be aware of. I mean, he's going to do that. Obviously, he'll do that. He didn't do it. And the last day, when he's headed on vacation, I just stayed in my office all day waiting for the phone to call. It didn't ever ring. And I looked out my window, and there he was walking out the front door of the hospital with his pipe in his mouth and his Wall Street Journal under his arm, which were signals that I knew I'm going home. And I panicked, literally panicked. I jumped out of my seat, hit my door, went out the side door, came to the parking lot where he was just getting in his car, and I didn't know what to say. And I just blurted out. I said, Stan, you're going on vacation for a couple of weeks? He said, yeah. He said, well, do you have any advice? He said, yes, don't do anything dumb. He got in his car and drove away. That was it. But in that message was, and I talked to him about it after when he came back, he said, look, I know you're young. I know you don't have a lot of experience, but I think you've got common sense. And I always felt he had a lot of common sense. He's just really a street smart guy. He said, I knew if you felt you needed me, you'd find a way to find me. I didn't have to give you chapter and verse on that. And he said, I also knew you'd probably make a mistake or two. And I understand that. I cut you a lot of slack while you're with me. But, it was a big important but, never make the same mistake twice. That always weighed on me as a stewardship to him for his trust in me to validate his trust.
That is a very interesting story on several levels. But would you, as a manager, have done that to one of your subordinates? Gone away without letting them know?
No, I would not. I would have been inclined the other way around. We would have had not a big chat, but we'd had at least a little chat. At least I would have said goodbye.
Oh, yeah. You went to Southside Hospital in Mesa. Could you tell a little bit about that hospital that you were now to be leading?
Yeah. We took that position, which was facilitated by the faculty at the University of Minnesota. They were doing a lot of consulting at the time. I mentioned that earlier in the interview, and they were consulting that little hospital, which was hoping to build a replacement hospital, which was desperately needed. This was really a throwback to the 1920s kind of a facility in a growing population, expanding population out of the Phoenix. All the small towns around Phoenix, including Mesa, 20 miles to the east, were just booming with population growth. They really needed a replacement hospital. And that was the idea, that I would go down, become the CEO, and facilitate the construction of a new hospital. They also had some other operational problems. The quality of care, medium, morale low, landlocked, horrible facility, and management challenges. The board had finally given up and fired the CEO and the director of nursing and the chief financial officer the same day. So here I came down, just turned 30, and into play as a CEO. So it was a wonderful situation to turn around. And in a young man's career, putting that on your resume was a real gift. The question is, are you going to be able to turn it around? And there were some daunting tasks there that made that problematic, which caused a lot of sleepless nights.
Do you recall what you tackled first?
The major problem was building staff, to find a CFO and to find a director of nursing and try to increase the morale and try to improve the quality and focus at the same time on a political campaign, which was required because the hospital, the concept for building the new hospital And financing it would be based on acquiring tax-exempt bonds to borrow the money to build a new hospital. The hospital didn't have a lot of reserves itself. And so you could, in Arizona and several other western states at the time, follow the pattern of school districts and irrigation districts and improvement districts and form a hospital district where the property owners in the district, the defined district, would vote through a referendum if they were willing to use their property as collateral, collective property, as collateral to finance the bonds, to give a guarantee to the bond investors, bond holders. It was done quite frequently in California and Oregon, Washington, and this was the attempt to do it in Arizona. And so I was thrown into this political campaign, which I knew nothing about, never been involved with politics, to get the people in Mesa and Tempe, Arizona, that was the boundary that was selected, to support that proposition. And it failed. It failed because there was a Nebraska rancher who retired to Mesa who hated taxing districts all his life. It was his passion to oppose them. And he took this one on himself. He walked every street in Mesa, knocked on every door, with a voice of warning that their property taxes could go up if this hospital didn't fail, and there's no guarantee it would be successful. And he was very successful in his argument. And so he lost the campaign, which left me in a position of, frankly, desperation, because I was young, inexperienced, naive, assumed we'd win it. The board was convinced we were going to win it. That was one of the reasons I went, because they were so confident they were going to win it. I didn't have plan B. I didn't have a backup position to immediately announce. So there was a moment of truth in my career. Literally, that moment was the nexus of, was my career going to continue to move along in a pattern you'd hope for with continued growth and opportunity, or were they going to come to a screeching halt and failure? And that was a very crucial time in our career and lives.
From the way you described that, it seems like you felt that the onus was on you to solve the problem. Did you not have guidance from your board?
No. They didn't have a backup plan either. So we were stuck in that moment of decision. What happened the next morning was chaotic because, of course, the press was all over it. The medical staff was all over it. The employees, the board itself, all calling me. And when I got to the office, there was a stack of messages to return. I just asked my secretary, just hold everything. I'll speak to the press. I'll speak publicly in 2 hours. I went in my office and went through that very deep, personal, reflective period of time trying to decide what to do short term, which was come out and say something that would keep the hospital alive, the idea of a new hospital alive, with some confidence. And the other one, what's the answer going to be? How am I going to do that? What came to me in that 2 hours was, as I searched through, what do I know? What do I know? Who do I know? What have I seen? Two things, both in the Twin Cities during my time there. One was my own boss, Stan Nelson, who had merged with a neighboring hospital and formed the first not-for-profit, non-religious merger in the country. And it was very successful.
All right, let's stop there. The first not-for-profit, non-religious merger in the United States, and this was between Northwestern
and Abbott Hospital.
And Abbott.
And it became Abbott Northwestern. Abbott had no space to grow. Northwestern did, knocked down some neighborhood buildings. And so the hospitals merged. They were very compatible boards, the same representation of the community. Both medical staff was basically overlapped. And so it was a very compatible kind of a merger. Happened very rapidly. And then the expansion came on the campus in Northwestern Hospital. And it became very successful over the years. So
and then the second model?
Second model was Northwestern Hospital's competitor, major competitor, which was Fairview Hospital, a Lutheran hospital run by a man named Carl Plato. And he was the one that conceived building a suburban hospital as part of a downtown hospital, the satellite hospital concept, which was also the first in the country. And ironically, my friend Don Wegmuller was part of that development of that satellite hospital and became the assistant administrator of that hospital in the suburbs of Minneapolis. The logic of that was well rationed. There was a solid rationale for doing it, because they could obviously save a lot of unnecessary duplication at every level of management. They could share many services. They could get it off to a very fast start. The medical staff was thrilled to be able to have a hospital near where some of their offices were in the suburbs. So we just go down a lot more pluses. But it was beautifully thought out and a very successful venture. So back to Mesa.
I'd like to stop for another. Sorry.
Yeah.
What is a satellite hospital?
Satellite hospital is a hospital that has the same board, the same management team. It shares services between the two institutions and does not have to duplicate all of the services, can lean upon the mother hospital, if you will, for a lot of the services they would have to duplicate. So it's a much less costly operation than otherwise. And it gets off to a very fast start because you've got a running start already, because you've got a very successful mothership, if you will. So I'm back to Mesa. I'm in the office. These two concepts come to my mind, and I'm saying to myself, wow, what would happen if we could find our mothership in Phoenix, the largest, best, most respected, financially strong hospital? We could merge with them if they were interested, and then we could build this hospital in Mesa as a satellite of their hospital, follow the Plato model. And that's what came to mind and gave me some hope. At least there's some direction here that I could pursue. I couldn't say that when I came out of the office because I hadn't talked to anybody else about it. So I said, what you have to say? I said, we'll have a plan, and we'll have an announcement to make. And I chose a month, so we'd have some time to work this all out, at least give it a try. And talked to my board about it immediately, and they gave me permission to enter into discussions. I didn't know Steve Morris, who was the leader of that hospital and a national figure. He was on the board of the AHA, going to become the chair of the AHA, was a candidate to be the chief executive officer of the AHA at the time, before Alex McMahon. So he had a very high profile, very well respected, a powerful personality. And I just called him up cold, and I said, I'm new in town. We hadn't met yet. I'd like to come over and visit with you about our hospital. And he was gracious, and I went over and talked to him, and the lights just like that. But I'd read something he said at one of the AHA meetings, that hospitals have to be more proactive in working together. And I picked up on that theme when I sat down with him. I said, I've got an idea for you regarding your idea. And we had that merger completed in 6 months. And that gave us his balance sheet to leverage on. We didn't have to do these bonds. We didn't have to do another election. His balance sheet was strong enough to get bonds sold into the marketplace, and we used that revenue source or capital creation source to build a new hospital, which we did. I had the chance to help plan that, lead the planning of it actually, put it into play, and it was a great experience.
It's pretty clear why you wanted and needed to do this deal.
Right.
But why was Good Sam interested?
Steve Morris's perception was that hospitals need to be more aggressive, more proactive, and he realized that the suburbs were growing so fast that if he didn't have a part of those suburbs within his system, he could be blocked from a lot of referrals.
So this is about building referral relationships.
That's what it was about.
And
as well as his desire to be a pioneer and to create a new approach and to follow the Plato model.
Let's go back to the early 70s. So you're in Mesa, and the opportunity kind of suddenly comes about, doesn't it, to become the CEO of the flagship. Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
That was a quantum leap. Again, unexpected. And I felt I was unprepared for it, because going from a 100-bed rural hospital, fundamentally, very simple services, non-complex, no teaching, no research, just and no sophisticated facilities, not a tertiary care by any means, to a tertiary care facility with teaching programs, with research programs, going from 100 plus beds to 500 plus beds. It was a huge difference, no matter how you calibrate it. It came about because the fellow I merged with, Steve Morris, after our merger, was suddenly faced with two other opportunities, unexpected, for other hospitals to join in with this merger concept. They were on the other end of the valley, on the west end of the greater Phoenix suburban area, and they were in the same boat we were at Southside. They had limited funds, needed funding for expansion, and they came to Samaritan. It wasn't called Samaritan. They came to Good Samaritan Hospital and invited themselves into the system, and they were accepted, which, not in the system, as an affiliate of Good Samaritan, which then became a system as a result of those three mergers. The flagship, now 3 suburban hospitals, became Samaritan Health Service, a not-for-profit multi-hospital system in Phoenix. Steve Morris moved into a central office to be the CEO over all of that. His board became the single board for those hospitals. There were advisory boards in the other hospitals. And he set up a staff. But he vacated the CEO position at his hospital, where he trained as a young man, spent all of his career up till then, and asked me to come in from Mesa, from this new construction project, to take his place. It was shocked me at the time, because I still was very young.
How long had you been on board?
I'd been in Mesa we went down there in 1967, and this would have been about 1969 or 70.
Could you please talk about the LDS Church and the church's involvement in healthcare right around this time in the mid-70s?
Be glad to. The LDS Church had been involved, like other religions across the country, in the founding of healthcare in the United States in terms of building hospitals, the Catholic Church setting the precedent, with the Catholic immigrants coming, the nuns following, building those wonderful hospitals wherever the Catholics migrated. The nuns were there to build the facilities. Such a high standard and such a great example to all the other religions, including the LDS Church. And in the pioneer days here, there was no other entity that had the resources or the ability and the leadership to build hospitals. And so the LDS Church stepped into that void for its members and built the hospitals, which were open to, of course, to everyone. And over the years, that continued and became a hospital system with some qualifications about system. There were very few central services. Fundamentally, it was more like an association of LDS hospitals. Each hospital had their own board. Each hospital had their own medical staffs, planned their own strategies, figured out their own finances, define their own services, and so forth. About 5 years prior to the big decision of the church to divest their hospitals, there began to be a little more centralization, but not significant. The reason for the church decision to move away from operating hospitals came as a result of the fact that the senior leadership of the church, responsible for hospitals, as well as all of the other non-religious entities of the church, which includes the church's quite extensive, what we call the welfare program, which are farms, ranches, other ways to produce goods and materials and food to assist us with helping our poor within the church and to respond to emergencies across the world. They had that responsibility, and all of the other businesses affiliated with that, including ZCMI, we talked about earlier. And they were just running really hard. There were just 3 of them. Their title was the presiding bishopric of the church, and the presiding bishopric, again, has this temporal responsibility for the church. In the hospitals, they had 15 hospitals. They had logic to them, said we need to be involved, so they each were trying to be the chairman of the board of 5 hospitals. They just divided them up equally. These hospitals were spread up and down Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming, and it was a daunting demand on their time, their travel, and so forth. And because they had so much more to do than they had time to do, they invited Crescent, McCormick, and Paget, which was a consulting firm was of good reputation at the time, to come and coach them, help them try to figure out how they might better use their time. This bishopric, these three men. And the consultant lead man, Earl Frederick, who had been a hospital administrator himself, which was very helpful in Chicago at the Children's Hospital, just asked him directly. He said, "You are spending so much time with these hospitals. Is the Operation Hospital central to the mission of your church? You need to ponder that." And they began to ponder it and concluded, no, it wasn't part of the doctrine. It was just happened because of the things I mentioned earlier. They stepped into a void that needed to be filled. But now these communities are strong, able, and probably willing to assume responsibility themselves for the hospitals. They also face the reality at the time there was a debate in the Congress, U.S. Congress, about whether hospitals who accepted federal money, e.g. Medicare, would be required to do abortion on demand. That was being highly focused in the news, and that, of course, caught their attention because the church would not be any more compatible with that than several other religions, including the Catholic Church. So they dealt with that, and then within the church, if they were looking at the budget going into the capital improvements that were necessary in the hospitals, and looking at about they thought $100 million, which turned out to be 10 times that much. They thought, is it right for us to spend $100 million fundamentally in this center part of the West when our church is worldwide and we have demands from all over the world for new buildings, new temples, new schools, and so forth? What about the balance and priority here of our resources? And they concluded that no, they weren't central to the mission of the church, and yes, they could be divested. Now, divested is the key word. I didn't say sold. They didn't say sold. They could have sold it. I know how much they could have received for it because I was approached by Hospital Corporation of America to represent HCA even before the church was talking about publicly about their interest in divesting. HCA thought they might be interested if the price was right. And I knew what the price was that they were offering. And it didn't matter. And I told HCA at the time, but I don't think they'll sell it. If they want to be out of that work and that responsibility, I don't think they'll sell it because they all understand that if they sell it, then whoever buys it is going to have to recoup the investment, which will mean incremental costs for the debt, for the buying the new system. Therefore, you have that unnecessary new cost built upon the consumers. And the church will not be interested in doing that because it's not a financial operation. It's a church. That turned out to be true. And so when they decided to leave the business, they divested it, which means they turned it over to an organization that they helped to form, but just at the board level. They asked these men and women in the community, and it was a beautifully put together, diverse board and from every angle, including religion, gender, background, professions, and so forth, geography. Just a beautiful job of putting that group together. And then they just said, it's yours. We're giving this to you as a gift. Here are the resources. Here are the hospital assets. Here are all the personnel. Take this if you're willing to be of service without pay, because it'll be a not-for-profit organization. And are you willing to validate our decision to do this by committing yourselves to be stewards to create a model healthcare system in the country? And I'm sure there were some long pauses. That's a pretty high standard for a rural state to step forward and want to be a model for the rest of the sophisticated country. But the members who said yes were deeply committed to that. And when I was interviewed for the position through the headhunter, of course, that's the first question they asked me. Are you willing to take this stewardship yourself? That was the hardest professional question I ever had asked. Am I really willing to do that? Do I think I can do that? Do I have the ability to do that? Do I have a desire to do that? I'm in a very comfortable position in Newport Beach, California, arguably one of the most beautiful places in California, probably in the country. A beautiful hospital looking over Newport Harbor, a lovely office with bougainvillea on the wall, looking out over the harbor, a compatible medical staff, a good board, very reputable board, good things going on. Leave that comfort zone, if you will, and take on this unknown thing and try to make it a modern healthcare system. I accepted soberly, but it was that challenge was the most valuable asset I had as the leader over all the years I was there, and continues to be for my successors. There's only been 3 of us over nearly 40 years, but each of us, when we came into our positions, made that commitment. It wasn't formal; you didn't stand up and make a pledge, but it was just understood that you were going to continue this tradition of moving Intermountain Healthcare always toward becoming a model healthcare system. That was a powerful tool. I never gave a talk to our employees, never wrote a newsletter to our employees, never made a community presentation about Intermountain Healthcare anywhere in the world without mentioning those beginnings and that imperative, which then was very strong. And when I recruited my management team, of course, I passed that challenge on to them. Are they willing to assume stewardship to make that happen? And they all happily said yes. And we were together as a team, 5 of us for nearly 20 years, back to back, working very diligently to try to fulfill that pledge of expectation.
I'd like to come back to that idea of a model healthcare system in a moment, but it was just a remarkable gift of the church, and probably can't be overstressed, the importance of that incredible gift. Was there a precedent for this?
No. The phrase I've often used, and I just forgot to mention, it was unprecedented at the time, and unduplicated since. It's really one solo experience.
And they truly did walk away, the church. They just gave it. They didn't try to micromanage anything. They just said, bon voyage, do a good job.
Yeah.
There was no attempt to remain influential by placing certain people on the board. Rather, they hoped and trusted and prayed, I'm sure, that because there were good people who accepted this stewardship challenge.
You have it just right.
Yeah.
And there were no church leaders on the board. I kind of expected and kind of wanted them to check in once in a while so we could at least tell them what we were doing. But they just had the discipline not to do that.
All right, back to the model healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
I'm tempted to just say, what is a model healthcare system? But I know that you gave it study, that you looked at Mayo, you looked at Kaiser, you looked at the Cleveland. How did you begin to figure out what a model healthcare system looked like?
Well, those were very helpful models, and we found a lot of compatibility in those models, Kaiser included, because they all started with a passion and with a sense of stewardship responsibility for defined programs or geographies. We love the Mayo story, rural beginnings in Rochester, Minnesota, 2 very bright physicians who just thought there was a better way to practice medicine by bringing a group of physicians together who would share stewardship for an individual patient's needs. You get all of that expertise focused on one patient. What a beautiful concept it is. And it's been very successful, but very seldom duplicated. There are many Mayos around, but not very many.
For instance?
I like to think of of Pennsylvania. Geisinger. They come very close to that. Probably the best. And that's why they're mentioned along with Mayo as a model for the future. Kaiser, a different kind of a thing, but very similar in the sense that they had a passion. Mr. Kaiser had a problem. He was building ships, later built cars. After the war, they built ships, and the country was totally dependent on him to build these ships. And he had to diversify his locations of building because there were still threats of Japanese bombing. So he had to be all along the West Coast, not just in one port. And that meant he had a spread of all these ports and all these construction sites for these boats. And there were industrial accidents and marginal care being given in these small towns and these small ports like Portland at the time. And so he just, like Henry Ford did when he built the Henry Ford Hospital, he just stepped in and built Kaiser Hospitals. But it was also for his employees. And so he followed the model of Ford, employed physicians, and took care of it, provided the insurance as a benefit, and set the whole Kaiser model into place. Now, that wasn't our model. We weren't starting out hiring physicians, but we were starting out trying to bring together into some kind of unity and share services, economies of scale, like Kaiser did, like Mayo did later, into play. So the whole idea of a model system is it takes advantage of its size by creating economies of scale. It takes advantage of its mission by making a serious effort to improve quality, by being much more careful in the selection and approval of physician privileges, to be much more disciplined when things weren't going well in terms of quality, and to set high standards and goals for the operation financially. Our board said to us, look, we received a gift. We don't have a lot of debt. Therefore, shouldn't our cost to our patients be lower than other hospitals who require debt? We as a manager said yes. And he said, okay. They said, okay, then what percentage lower than the average should we be? And we came to a conclusion with some outside help from our auditing firm, E&E, that we should be 15% lower. And that became our standard and still is. We always operated at 15% lower than other hospitals in our region. Those kind of disciplines are what a system's all about. You can't do those kind of things when you're an association of hospitals. You can only do them when you have a central board who is dedicated to it and are willing to do something about it and put into new creative management tools and systems that can make that happen. It's a long answer to your question of what a system does. Strategy is crucially important. When you've got 15 hospitals, you have a sense of stewardship, then you're deeply involved in the role of each of those hospitals, what they should be, how they should be coordinated, how they should avoid duplication. Basically, there's a culture of hospitals, boards, that they want to be better, always want to be better, and that's good. And usually, historically, it's better than the next town's hospital. That old competition between the towns, the high school team competition, all those traditions, it comes into hospitals. And then you can get into this one-upsmanship game and have unnecessary duplication. In a system, you have the ability to try to contain that and define the role of each hospital so you don't have unnecessary duplications. And you can get economy of scale by buying in getting tech. That's a whole other subject of central purchasing, but you do move into that very quickly because that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. Being to get immediate savings. We got it immediately in purchasing when we brought all those independent purchasing offices in those hospitals together into one. We were buying at a much better scale, volume, therefore we're getting a lower price. And then we helped to form a national coalition of hospitals called Associated Healthcare Systems. We rented out of Intermountain Healthcare for a few years. And then we had 15 systems buying together. Now the prices really went down. We did the same thing when we brought insurance together, banking together, investing our portfolio together rather than independently. Get more return on your investments, you get less cost in your insurance. And you're able to provide insurance, malpractice insurance to physicians at a much lower cost by setting up your own malpractice insurance company in a co-op like we did with several other hospitals. I'm rattling on here, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of what a system can do that a freestanding hospital can't do. And we try to take full advantage of those opportunities that were there to be taken and create a few of our own that were new.
Well, it's a powerful concept and one that's been replicated all over the country. You kind of intrigued me when you talked about boards wanting their hospital to be better than the next town's. And I take it that better than probably means I've got more services than you do. I've got more high-tech equipment than
Exactly.
you do. I got more specialty docs than you do.
More beds.
Yeah, I'm bigger than you are. How does the concept of that kind of competition work in healthcare, do you think?
both good and bad. I think the natural competition can bring out the best in people and in services. Bring out the worst behavior, because you can get over-engaged in the competitive spirit and make mistakes. And there are many mistakes have been made where hospitals have tried to expand too fast, have run out of the resources. The demands are much greater than the resources, creating difficulties within the organization over fights of who's going to have the priority, which hospitals or which departments in a freestanding hospital. It's always this fine balance that has to be made by the board and by the CEO and the management team to have them, everybody, all the constituents understand that there have to be priorities. The art of it is to get all of them involved in helping to make those decisions, so they're just not commands, but they come from a process of participation. We found that very, very important in building our priorities within the system. Just that participation took a real edge off of that unnecessary and probably damaging kind of competition.
But you're speaking amongst of hospitals that are part of the same system.
Correct.
What about if we're talking about non-related hospitals?
There was a strong effort, a goodwill effort, I think, during the 80s and 90s, mostly in the 80s, 70s and 80s, to do cooperation. The federal government encouraged it. They had a process of requiring hospitals to talk to each other before they could get approval to make major expansion and expenditures. And I thought there were some really good things that came out of that, of tempering unnecessary growth and creating cooperative ventures between hospitals and trying to lower the cost of capital investments. But that, like all regulation, the bubble burst on that as well. And then came antitrust after that, and where you really couldn't sit down with your competitor and talk about doing things together. It was not legal to do it. And that brought all of that era to a close, unfortunately. And that remains in place today. You really cannot sit down with your competitor and say, let's do this, that, and the other, and divide the market in any way at all.
That's an interesting observation. I wonder if you might comment on the often cited statement that all healthcare is local. As you were working with this system of 15 hospitals, and I'm sure tempted to start to go out and get bigger.
Yeah.
How does that play? Do you buy that concept?
Generally, I do. I think the key decisions are made locally. It's the local volunteers in the not-for-profit system serving on those boards that make those decisions. So yes, it is local. There is no federal strategy or federal plan of operation of hospitals or indicating what hospitals should do what or where they should be. Or it's a very open economic environment, the free enterprise system at work in healthcare. So those decisions are made local, unless you're like a HCA with a national ownership and you're a for-profit hospital. There's a lot of controls there, and those aren't local controls. Those are national strategies of what hospitals will be doing what, where they'll be built, where they'll be closed, and so forth. But generally, going back to your question, yes, it's local. Then the fun comes when you try to define what's local. Is local your neighborhood? Is local your city? Or in our case, is local our region? We took the approach that local was our region. That healthcare is local, yes, but our location, if you will, for our service area was the whole Intermountain area. And we stayed in the Intermountain area. Interestingly enough, our board chair, Bill Jones, very thoughtful man, experienced man, when he saw his management team start to get invitations when we got a little visibility to expand outside of our natural region. California was a draw. Midwest was a draw. We had invitations from Florida. We had invitations overseas and some of the Arab countries to build IHC hospitals all around the country. And we started to ponder that. Frankly, to young CEOs and managers, there's a lot of interest and excitement in that. It's kind of complimentary and validating and get your juices going. This is the next new thing. It's going to get bigger and better. And that's not necessarily the case. Bigger and better aren't locked together. And he explained that to us with this question. and I give him great credit for it. Would you rather be, talking to the management committee, would you rather be smaller and stronger or larger and weaker? And that was a very good question. And it brought us back home to our roots and say we were going to, instead of wanting to continue to grow horizontally, and basically everything was pretty well covered in the Intermountain States by then, didn't need a lot of new hospitals, other than there was suburban spurts where you have hospitals, new hospitals, but not a lot of growth outside the area. Then we had no growth outside the area. Rather than that, we grew vertically. We expanded our service within our zone rather than try to just keep building hospital outside of our zone. And that turned out to be a very good decision, and it's paying great dividends now as we look at this law being involved, because those hospitals and systems who have integrated, if you will, cradle-to-grave services and a strong emphasis on quality within all of those parts of the delivery system and control it, and can take risks out of the financial state, to take risk to bid on a defined population at a defined rate per person per year, the old HMO model. That's what we're going to be seeing in the future, I think. And those systems that are integrated vertically and are quality driven will be in a very strong position in the future.
Your friend and colleague, David Jepson, told me a story about the origins of Intermountain Healthcare's involvement in managed care. And it was a fascinating story about the discount demand that Blue Cross Blue Shield made of Intermountain. And also ties back to what you were talking about previously about your decision to to have lower charges. Could you tell that story?
There were two strong entities in the state at that time. The two strongest entities on the payment side and on the delivery side were Blue Cross. There weren't many other insurance companies involved at the time. I think only one or two commercial companies. No other Blue Cross plan. It was a singular plan for the state. And Intermountain Healthcare as the largest healthcare hospital provider in the state. And so we had to come together once a year to negotiate payment. This is non-Medicare, because it's regular insurance sponsored by employers, which Blue Cross contracted with. And they in turn contracted with us to determine how much they were going to pay us for our services and providing the hospital care. There was always a debate. They always wanted to pay less. We always wanted a little more. And that dynamic just went on, and it worked quite well. Until there was a change of direction at our local Blue Cross. And there were no longer hospital administrators on the Blue Cross board. That was part of federal regulations to separate the two. So we didn't have those collegial relationships in place that we had in previous years, which goes right back to the beginnings of the founding of Blue Cross, with the AHA playing a major role in the founding of Blue Cross nationally. So there we are now in a more business-like approach. And they decided to get quite proactive on their negotiations with the argument that you can afford to charge less, because over the years, these last 7 or 8 years you've been in operation, you've been frugal, and we had a strong philosophy about being frugal and saving a lot of money as much as we could every year within reason, and still keep our rates low. That kind of a narrow trough you're in there with the pressures on both sides. One side is to keep your rates lower than the competition. The other trough is try to make as much margin as you can to put into the rainy day fund. And they saw our rainy day fund, we didn't call it that, but it was our reserves. And they said, look, you've got all the reserves. You can afford not to take a rate increase for the next 4 or 5 years. And we think you should take no rate increase and pass that savings along to the employers through our insurance. And we said, wait a minute, if we do that, then you're really taking the lifeblood away from our independence. We will have no reserves, therefore we cannot respond to construction programs, the new technology to new programs. We'd just be neutered, if you will. And of course that's incompatible. And then they suggested, well, we think you should at least consider much less expectation, and we're going to go to the public through the media, and we're going to explain this dilemma to the media so everybody will know. And that was the moment of truth about our sense of, should I say, collegial relationship with Blue Cross. It suddenly turned into a very difficult, stressful business relationship. And at that moment, we decided that, in a sidebar, but a really important sidebar, the timing was uncanny, because it was just at that same time that President Clinton and his wife Hillary, she having been assigned by him to come forward with a proposed reform for the healthcare system in the country, had within her proposal, which was well known and she was articulating all around the country, that it would be kind of based on the HMO model, and that doctors, hospitals, and insurance companies would have to come together in cooperatives, if you will, and take mutual responsibility and risk for a defined population, which would be all of the uninsured. That was her approach. A lot of merit to it. We see a lot of echoes of that in this new health plan. But we said to ourselves, you mean we were going to have to go to Blue Cross and become partners? We're going to have to go to all these independent physicians, none of them very few of them in clinics, mostly in the West, single or 2 or 3 member practices, and make individual deals with all of them about taking risks together. That just seems to be impossible to do that. And so that's when we decided that we would form our own insurance company, so that we would be on the same song sheet, under the same leadership, with the same goals. And that was also at the time, ironically, that we were beginning to really get serious about not just doing the very best we could with quality, basically at the nursing level, but we would really do it in terms of the process management. That was the very beginnings of continual quality improvement, improving the processes. And how are we going to do that if we're not together with the physicians, wanting to do it together rather than are trying to impose it on them? And so all of that led to 2 major directional decisions for Intermountain Healthcare. One was to start our own insurance company, which we did. And not too long after that, then inviting physicians to come into our organization, into leadership positions, memberships on our boards, and involvement as employees of the system if they were so inclined. Never force it. But we acquired the 2 major reputable clinics in Salt Lake who were anxious to come in because they were facing a lot of restraints themselves and challenges with capital improvements, didn't have strong balance sheets. So all of that kind of in a swirl of external realities and possibilities for the direction of the future came to a solid core within Intermountain Healthcare with our decision to be more than a system of hospitals, that we would truly be responding to our name. We're not Intermountain Hospital System, we were Intermountain Healthcare. And in healthcare it involved all of it, including even the financing of the system through the insurance companies that we started. A long answer to your question.
As we wrap up, I wonder if you'd like to take the opportunity, Scott, of speaking a little more about the partnership with your wife and how that's developed and supported you over the years.
I would be so pleased to give her credit where credit is due. You've gotten acquainted with her in the last 3 or 4 hours. You can sense what kind of a personality she is, but more important, what kind of a spirit she has. She's without guile. Her total focus is to make life as easy as, not easy, but as right, if you will, for her husband and for her children, to represent the strong values that she believes in, be the example within the family for that, to guide us all in directions that will keep us safe from any kind of harm, physically or spiritually or emotionally. When we stumble, to help bind our wounds and build us up. And create a safe harbor for all of us, including our grandchildren, who can't wait to come here, to be in her presence and to feel of her strength. In professional matters, I'll say this with she thinks I'm exaggerating, but I'm absolutely convinced, and sincerely so, that several of the key jobs that came to us over the years, particularly in Intermountain Healthcare, much of the credit can go to this woman, because she was just so well received by those boards as they saw the kind of strength she was for me and realized this was going to be a partnership. She was going to be front and center in almost all of the activities that were social and with the travel and representation, and she was just so extremely well, and that I had an asset that perhaps others didn't have as clearly as she was to me in making it a team effort. And they knew that she would keep things at home stable and add as an asset there as well, so that I could spend a lot of time on the work and not the details of making a house run, which she has done magnificently.